October 1951, early evening, Lenox Avenue, Harlem. Albert Anastasia stepped out of a black sedan while the street was still busy enough to remember his face. He did not bring a crew. He did not bring a weapon that anyone could see. He walked instead, slow and deliberate, past numbers, runners, barber shops, and men who stopped talking the moment they recognized him. This was not his burrow. Everyone present understood that. Anastasia kept moving anyway. He had come north to settle a problem that had begun to cost money, pride, and control. Somewhere ahead of him, in territory that did not answer to the five families, Bumpy Johnson was already aware he was coming. By the time Anastasia reached the corner, the decision that would reshape Harlem's balance of power had effectively been made. The boundary the Mafia did not cross. For years, Harlem existed as an exception inside New York's criminal map. Italian crews worked around it, not through it. Numbers, protection, and vice flowed under Bumpy Johnson's supervision, and disputes rarely traveled far before being quietly settled. The arrangement was not written, but it was respected. Anastasia understood boundaries better than most men alive. That was precisely why his presence north of 110th Street mattered. Boundaries were only tested when someone believed the cost of crossing them had dropped. Harlem's status had not been granted by sentiment or ideology. It had been earned through consistency. Bumpy Johnson paid his debts. He enforced his rules evenly. He kept violence contained and predictable, which mattered more than morality in New York's underworld. The Italians noticed this early. They learned that Harlem did not produce chaos when left alone. It produced revenue, order, and stability. Those were valuable commodities. So an understanding formed, not out of respect for Bumpy as a man, but respect for what he controlled. The five families ran most of the city through layered hierarchies and interchangeable soldiers. Harlem operated differently. Bumpy sat at the center of a network that extended into storefronts, churches, nightclubs, and apartments. Information traveled quickly there. So did consequences. When a dispute surfaced, it was handled before it could grow teeth. That efficiency kept outside crews from seeing opportunity. There was nothing to exploit that wasn't already accounted for. Albert Anastasia knew this history. He also knew how quickly such arrangements could decay. In his world, no territory was sacred. It was only defended until someone proved it could no longer be. He had watched unions fall, crews fracture, and long-standing bosses lose relevance when they mistook stability for permanence. From his perspective, Harlem's independence was tolerable only as long as it remained useful. The pressure had been building quietly. Gambling revenue from Harlem didn't always flow where Anastasia believed it should. Certain disputes required more negotiation than he liked. Messages came back slower than expected. These were not crises. They were signals. In Anastasia's experience, signals were ignored at great cost. Men who waited too long lost leverage. Men who moved early defined the terms. Still, Harlem was different. Sending enforcers would have been an admission that Bumpy was worth confronting through violence. Anastasia did not want a war. Wars attracted attention, created unpredictability, and damaged profit. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted Harlem to remember who ultimately decided what happened in New York. That was why the boundary mattered. Crossing into Harlem personally was not about intimidation alone. It was a test of response. Would Bumpy react defensively? Would his people mobilize? Would fear ripple outward? Those reactions would reveal whether the cost of crossing the line had truly dropped. What Anastasia found instead was calm, no streets emptied, no men scrambled. The absence of reaction was not ignorance, it was confidence. Harlem did not brace itself because it did not feel threatened. That detail would have registered immediately with a man like Anastasia. Power announced itself not through noise, but through how little it needed to do. The boundary held because it was supported from both sides. Italians benefited from a Harlem that regulated itself. Bumpy benefited from not provoking unnecessary attention. Neither side gained from breaking the equilibrium unless something fundamental had shifted. Anastasia came to determine whether it had. By the time he stood in Harlem, the answer was already taking shape. The cost of crossing the boundary had not dropped. It had merely become harder to measure. That uncertainty was dangerous. Men like Anastasia thrived on certainty, on knowing exactly what violence would produce. Harlem offered no such clarity. And in the underworld, when the cost cannot be calculated, the smartest move is often restraint. Why Anastasia came personally. Anastasia did not delegate moments like this. He was the enforcement arm of Murder, Inc., a man whose reputation traveled faster than his orders. Sending soldiers into Harlem would have signaled weakness or impatience. Cumming himself signaled intent. There had been friction over gambling money, over respect, over who ultimately decided what happened in black-controlled territory. Anastasia wanted clarity. He believed clarity could be imposed by proximity. Albert Anastasia had built his power on directness. He did not hide behind committees or layers of intermediaries when a situation mattered. When he showed up, it was meant to settle questions permanently. In his experience, uncertainty was a failure of leadership. Men followed him because they understood what his presence meant. He did not threaten often. He did not need to. His arrival was the threat. Harlem, however, resisted his usual logic. It was not run by rotating crews or fragmented loyalties. Bumpy Johnson did not answer to a commission, and he did not depend on Italian muscle to enforce his will. That independence was unusual, and unusual structures required personal inspection. Anastasia had learned long ago that you could not judge a power base from reports alone. You had to feel it. You had to watch how people behaved when you entered the room. There was also pride involved, though Anastasia would not have framed it that way. He had spent decades eliminating men who challenged Italian dominance, directly or indirectly. Harlem's continued autonomy was tolerated, but tolerance had limits. Each year that Bumpy operated without interference reinforced the idea that there were spaces the Mafia chose not to control. That idea, left unchecked, could spread. The dispute itself was not dramatic on its surface. Gambling revenue did not align with expectations. Certain operators deferred to Bumpy before answering to Italian partners. Decisions took consultation rather than compliance. These were small frictions, the kind that rarely justified violence on their own. But Anastasia understood how small frictions accumulated. They became precedents. Precedents became permissions. Anastasia did not want to send a message through bloodshed. Harlem was too visible for that. Violence there traveled quickly into headlines and hearings. It brought scrutiny that threatened everyone involved. He wanted something cleaner, a visit, a conversation, a recalibration. By appearing alone, he framed the encounter as adult business rather than invasion. There was calculation in that choice. Walking in without an entourage forced Bumpy to confront him as an equal, not as a target. It removed excuses for escalation. If Bumpy reacted violently, he would own the consequences. If he did not, Anastasia could claim that restraint had been offered and recognized. This was how Anastasia managed power. He created situations where the outcome seemed voluntary, even when it was not. Men believed they had chosen compliance. In reality, they had been guided there by pressure applied at exactly the right point. He also believed in the theater of presence. A man like Anastasia carried his history with him. Every contract he had ordered, every body he had authorized, followed him into the street. Harlem knew who he was. That knowledge was supposed to do the work for him. He expected unease. He expected doors to close, conversations to pause, eyes to lower. Those reactions would confirm that fear still functioned as leverage. What he did not expect was indifference wrapped in discipline. Harlem did not greet him as a conqueror or a threat. It registered him as a factor, not a determinant. That distinction mattered. It suggested that Bumpy's authority did not depend on excluding men like Anastasia, but on absorbing their presence without yielding ground. By coming personally, Anastasia intended to assert final authority. Instead, he exposed himself to measurement. Harlem observed him the same way he observed them. Power, in that moment, was not about who could inflict more harm. It was about who could stand still and force the other man to account for his own limits. Anastasia believed clarity could be imposed by proximity. What he encountered was a structure that did not require his approval to continue functioning, and that realization, more than any threat, shaped what followed. Bumpy Johnson was already waiting. Bumpy Johnson did not rush to meet threats. By the time Anastasia arrived, Bumpy had already been briefed, already weighed the consequences, already chosen restraint. Harlem watched from storefronts and windows, not out of fear, but anticipation. Bumpy had survived decades by understanding timing. Letting Anastasia walk in unharmed was not courtesy. It was control exercised quietly. Bumpy understood what Anastasia's presence meant the moment word reached him. Men like Anastasia did not appear unannounced without purpose. They came to measure, to provoke a response, to see whether the structure in front of them still held. Bumpy did not mistake the visit for diplomacy. He understood it as inspection. His decision not to react publicly was made early. Violence would have given Anastasia exactly what he wanted. Proof that Harlem could be destabilized by pressure. Panic would have revealed weakness. Overreaction would have invited escalation. Bumpy chose none of it. He allowed the visit to unfold as if it were expected, even routine. That posture communicated confidence without words. Harlem followed his lead. Store owners stayed open. Numbers runners kept moving. Men on corners did not reach for weapons or scatter. They observed. The street understood that if Bumpy had ordered action, it would already be happening. The absence of motion was itself instruction. In Harlem, stillness often preceded decision. Bumpy's authority rested on that shared understanding. He did not need to be seen everywhere at once. His influence traveled through people who trusted his judgment. When he waited, they waited. When he acted, they followed. Anastasia was walking into a system that had already synchronized around a single response. That response was patience. Bumpy also understood the advantage of letting Anastasia enter unchallenged. It reversed the expected dynamic. Anastasia was accustomed to arriving as the dominant force. Here he arrived as a guest who had not been invited but was being tolerated. That distinction mattered. It placed him inside Bumpy's environment, subject to Bumpy's pace. There was risk in this approach. Allowing a man like Anastasia to move freely carried danger, but Bumpy had calculated the limits. Anastasia would not start a public confrontation in Harlem. The cost was too high. The police presence, the visibility, the political consequences all constrained him. Bumpy trusted those constraints. He trusted his read of the man. Waiting also gave Bumpy time to watch. How did Anastasia walk? Who noticed him? Who avoided him? These details mattered. Power revealed itself in reaction. Bumpy read the street as Anastasia passed through it. He saw that fear did not ripple outward. Curiosity did. Respect did. That told him everything he needed to know. When the moment came to meet, Bumpy did not posture. He did not raise his voice or assert ownership. He allowed Anastasia to speak first. Men who rushed to dominate often exposed insecurity. Bumpy let silence do the work. Silence forced Anastasia to confront the fact that his presence alone was not enough. This was not bravado. It was discipline earned over years of survival. Bumpy had outlived rivals who mistook aggression for strength. He had learned that the most dangerous position was not confrontation, but inevitability. If he decided something would not happen, it did not happen. He did not need to prove that with force. By waiting, Bumpy framed the encounter on his terms. Anastasia could not escalate without revealing impatience. He could not retreat without acknowledging limits. Every option narrowed as long as Bumpy remained still. Harlem sensed this shift even if it could not articulate it. The street understood that something important was occurring precisely because nothing dramatic was happening. Power was being negotiated in silence, and silence favored the man who belonged there. Letting Anastasia walk in unharmed was not weakness. It was a demonstration. Bumpy was showing that Harlem did not react to outside pressure. It absorbed it, evaluated it, and decided when and if to respond. The conversation that wasn't public. They met without witnesses close enough to hear words, only close enough to feel the temperature drop. No shouting, no posturing. Anastasia spoke with the confidence of a man used to ending conversations permanently. Bumpy listened, hands still, posture relaxed. Whatever was said remained theirs alone, but the structure of the exchange was obvious. One man spoke from reputation. The other spoke from position. Anastasia did not waste time. Men like him never did. He framed the situation as imbalance, as something that required correction. Money was not flowing as expected. Decisions were being filtered. Respect, in his view, had become conditional. His tone carried the assumption that these issues would be resolved once they were acknowledged. He had arrived to be acknowledged. Bumpy did not interrupt. He had learned long ago that letting a man speak revealed more than challenging him mid-sentence. Anastasia's words carried a familiar weight. They were designed to remind, not to negotiate. Every sentence leaned on a history of violence that did not need to be recited. Bumpy understood the language. He had heard it before, spoken by men who no longer mattered. When Bumpy finally responded, it was without heat. He did not dispute Anastasia's reputation. He did not deny his reach. He did not question what Anastasia was capable of doing elsewhere in the city. He simply made clear what would not happen here. The distinction was subtle but absolute. Harlem was not refusing to cooperate. It was refusing to be absorbed. The conversation moved carefully, each phrase chosen to avoid escalation while still drawing lines. Anastasia pressed on authority. Bumpy answered with structure. Anastasia referenced consequences. Bumpy referenced stability. They were not arguing facts. They were testing limits. What mattered was not the content of the exchange, but the absence of reaction around them. No men stepped closer. No signals were given. The street remained neutral. That neutrality belonged to Bumpy. It told Anastasia that whatever happened next would be confined to this conversation. There would be no spontaneous show of force to tilt the balance. Anastasia likely expected resistance to take a different form: anger, defensiveness, appeals to autonomy. He encountered none of it. Bumpy treated the discussion as settled business, not a challenge to be won. That framing denied Anastasia the leverage of intimidation. Fear required acknowledgement. Bumpy offered none. At some point, the conversation slowed. Statements repeated with slight variations, a sign that neither man was yielding ground. This was where violence usually entered such meetings, when words failed to move outcomes. It did not happen here. Anastasia recognized the constraints as clearly as Bumpy did. Any overt act would fracture the careful balance he was trying to preserve. The exchange ended without resolution, because resolution was not possible on Anastasia's terms. Bumpy did not need agreement. He needed understanding. Anastasia left knowing that Harlem would continue to operate as it had, not because it was protected by force, but because it was organized to withstand pressure. Those nearby noticed the ending more than the conversation itself. There was no display, no final gesture, just separation. Anastasia turned away first. That detail did not go unnoticed. In the underworld, departure often spoke louder than arrival. The conversation that wasn't public achieved its purpose. It clarified boundaries without bloodshed. It demonstrated that reputation could open doors, but it could not reorder systems that were already functioning. Bumpy Johnson did not defeat Anastasia. He outlasted the moment Anastasia had created. Harlem absorbed the outcome quietly. There was no announcement because none was needed. Power had been reaffirmed not through declaration, but through the simple fact that nothing changed afterward. What Anastasia expected to happen? Anastasia expected submission or escalation. He had seen both before. Harlem, in his view, was valuable but ultimately replaceable. Violence could always reset negotiations. That assumption had worked everywhere else. It failed here because Bumpy did not respond to threats the way other men did. He did not match force with force. He allowed the imbalance to reveal itself. In Anastasia's experience, power functioned on a narrow spectrum. When pressure was applied, weaker men folded. Stronger men overreached and gave justification for being crushed. Both outcomes were acceptable. They clarified hierarchy. They made future dealings simpler. This pattern had repeated itself across unions, docks, and neighborhoods. It had become instinct. He expected Bumpy to follow one of those paths. If Bumpy conceded quietly, Harlem would be absorbed without disruption. If Bumpy resisted openly, Anastasia could escalate in controlled stages until resistance became untenable. Either way, Anastasia believed he would leave with a clearer claim over the territory than when he arrived. What unsettled him was the absence of either response. Bumpy did not concede, but he did not provoke. He did not harden his language or raise the stakes. He treated Anastasia's presence as a fact to be acknowledged, not a threat to be neutralized. That posture disrupted the logic Anastasia relied on. Violence, when used strategically, required contrast. It worked best when it was the loudest thing in the room. Here, violence would have been an interruption rather than a conclusion. It would have created questions Anastasia did not want asked. Why now? Why here? Why personally? Those questions invited scrutiny. Anastasia had also assumed that fear would do its work without instruction. His name had ended conversations before they began. Men adjusted behavior preemptively. Harlem did not. It adjusted behavior only insofar as it needed to observe. That restraint signaled a level of internal confidence that could not be corrected through intimidation alone. He expected Bumpy to mistake restraint for weakness. Many men did. They escalated prematurely, believing they had momentum. Bumpy did the opposite. He let Anastasia carry the weight of the encounter. Every moment without resolution forced Anastasia to confront the limits of his influence in that specific environment. The imbalance Anastasia anticipated was supposed to favor him. Instead, it became visible in reverse. He was the one outside his usual terrain. He was the one constrained by optics, politics, and consequence. Bumpy's stillness amplified those constraints. It reminded Anastasia that not all power was mobile. Anastasia had come prepared to impose terms. He had not come prepared to be denied a reaction. That denial mattered. It removed the urgency that violence fed on. Without urgency, there was no justification for escalation. Without escalation, there was no leverage. This was not a moral stand. Bumpy was not appealing to principle. He was demonstrating that his structure did not depend on Anastasia's approval or fear. It depended on continuity. As long as Harlem functioned, Anastasia's options narrowed. By the time Anastasia recognized this, the moment had passed. He could not force the outcome he expected without damaging his own position elsewhere. A misstep in Harlem would ripple outward. Other crews would watch. Other leaders would reassess. The cost of being seen as reckless outweighed the potential gain. What Anastasia expected to happen did not because the usual triggers were absent. No challenge demanded response. No weakness invited exploitation. Bumpy's refusal to perform either role exposed the limitations of Anastasia's approach. In the end, Anastasia left without the clarity he had sought, not because Bumpy had outmaneuvered him aggressively, but because he had denied him the conditions under which Anastasia's power operated best. That denial was quiet, but it was decisive. The moment power shifted without violence. Nothing happened in the way outsiders expected. No gunfire. No bodies. Anastasia left Harlem the same way he entered it, alive, intact, unchanged in appearance. But the absence of violence carried its own meaning. Word spread not because of what was done, but because of what had been permitted. Anastasia had come, spoken, and gone without claiming ground. In the underworld, outcomes were usually measured in damage, a beating, a disappearance, a shift in who collected money on which corner. Here, there was none of that. The streets returned to their routines immediately. That continuity was the result. It signaled that the visit had not altered the internal order. When a man like Anastasia arrived and nothing changed afterward, that itself was the message. Those who understood power recognized it quickly. Italian crews took note. They asked quiet questions. Had there been an agreement? Had Bumpy conceded privately? The answer, inferred from behavior rather than statements, was no. Operations continued exactly as before. Revenue flowed through the same channels. Disputes were resolved the same way. Harlem had absorbed the pressure without yielding. This was how power shifted without announcement. It did not move from one hand to another. It clarified which hands could not be forced to open. Anastasia's departure confirmed that Harlem was not subject to the kind of correction he usually administered. That realization traveled faster than any formal message. The absence of retaliation mattered as much as the absence of concession. Bumpy did not celebrate. He did not tighten control visibly. He did not punish anyone for the visit. Those reactions would have suggested vulnerability or relief. Instead, he let the moment pass as if it were expected. That treatment reduced Anastasia's visit to a data point rather than an event. Men on the street noticed who had not been summoned afterward. No emergency meetings, no sudden reshuffling of protection. That calm told them that the balance had held. In criminal systems, stability after pressure is the clearest indicator of strength. Anastasia understood this as well. Leaving without escalation was not defeat, but it was not victory. It was an acknowledgement of limits. He had tested the boundary and found it firm. Pressing further would require commitment he was not prepared to make under those conditions. Other bosses learned from this. Harlem was no longer viewed simply as autonomous. It was viewed as resilient. That distinction mattered. Autonomy could be temporary. Resilience implied endurance. It suggested that even direct intervention might not produce desired outcomes. This shift altered how negotiations were framed going forward. Harlem was partnered with, not pressured. Requests replaced demands. Communication became more deliberate. The absence of violence had reset expectations quietly but thoroughly. For Bumpy, the moment required no follow-up. He did not memorialize it. He did not reference it later. Power that needed to be cited was already weakening. His authority deepened precisely because he allowed the encounter to fade without spectacle. The most telling detail remained Anastasia's exit. He did not linger. He did not leave behind emissaries. He did not mark territory symbolically. He left Harlem as a place that would continue without him. That fact reshaped how others viewed both men. Nothing had happened in the dramatic sense, yet something irreversible had occurred. The city had witnessed a demonstration of restraint that functioned as dominance. In a world that equated power with force, Harlem had proven that control could be exercised by denying force its opportunity. That lesson did not require explanation. It required memory, and the men who paid attention remembered exactly what had not happened when Anastasia walked out of Harlem, how Harlem interpreted the silence. In the days that followed, Harlem adjusted its understanding of itself. Bumpy's authority hardened without a single public act. Italian crews recalculated. Respect replaced pressure. Anastasia's restraint was read not as mercy, but recognition. The street understood hierarchy instinctively, and the message was unmistakable. Harlem was not open territory. Nothing needed to be explained because nothing had been disrupted. That was how Harlem knew the encounter had gone its way. When power shifts through violence, everyone feels the aftershocks. When it shifts through silence, only those paying attention understand what has changed. Harlem paid attention. Men who worked numbers, protection, and bookmaking noticed that no new faces appeared. No Italian collectors arrived with revised instructions. No familiar routes were challenged. Business continued under the same assumptions as before. That continuity reinforced the conclusion that Bumpy's position had not been weakened by the visit. It had been confirmed. Italian crews reached the same conclusion from the outside. They did not hear of concessions or side agreements. They heard of nothing. That nothing told them that Anastasia had not secured what he wanted. In the underworld, failed pressure campaigns were rarely discussed openly. They were simply not repeated. Harlem became one of those places. The silence also affected internal discipline. Bumpy's people did not test boundaries in the aftermath. They did not push further or act emboldened. That restraint reflected confidence rather than caution. They understood that the balance held because it was meant to hold, not because it was being temporarily tolerated. Respect began to replace pressure in subtle ways. Requests came through intermediaries rather than enforcers. Conversations took on a different tone. Harlem was consulted, not instructed. These were small adjustments, but they accumulated into a clear shift in posture. The street interpreted Anastasia's restraint correctly. Mercy implied superiority. Recognition implied parity. Anastasia had recognized that Harlem's internal order could not be overridden cheaply. That recognition elevated Bumpy's standing without requiring him to claim it. Harlem's response was to normalize the outcome. By refusing to dramatize the event, it denied outsiders the chance to reinterpret it. There were no stories inflated for reputation, no warnings issued publicly. The encounter was allowed to become what it already was, a failed attempt to redefine authority. This approach protected Bumpy from future challenges. Men considering pressure campaigns now had precedent. They knew what happened when even the most feared enforcer in New York tested Harlem directly. He left without leverage. That knowledge discouraged experimentation. The silence also reinforced an internal lesson. Harlem did not need to advertise its strength. It needed to maintain its structure. As long as that structure held, outside pressure would dissipate on contact. Bumpy had taught this lesson before, but this time the example involved a name everyone respected. Over time, the moment faded from conversation but not from memory. It became a reference used quietly in negotiations. When questions arose about jurisdiction or authority, Harlem's response did not include threats. It included continuity. Continuity was the argument. For Bumpy, this interpretation was ideal. Authority that required explanation invited challenge. Authority that was understood operated without friction. Harlem moved forward as if nothing unusual had occurred, which ensured that nothing unusual would be attempted again. The silence did its work precisely because it was shared. Everyone involved understood what it meant, and everyone benefited from not forcing it into the open. Harlem remained closed territory not through isolation, but through mutual recognition of limits. By the end of the week, the city had adjusted. The map had not changed, but the lines were darker. Harlem's boundary was no longer just respected. It was remembered. Why the Mafia never forgot. Anastasia lived several more years, violent ones, before meeting his own end. But that walk into Harlem stayed with the men who heard about it. It became a reference point, a quiet reminder that some power structures could not be intimidated into compliance. Bumpy Johnson did not need to win publicly. He only needed Anastasia to leave knowing exactly where he stood. The Mafia remembered events that altered expectations. This was one of them. It did not end in blood or arrests, but it forced a recalibration of how influence worked in parts of the city that did not conform to traditional hierarchy. Harlem was no longer treated as a problem to be solved. It was treated as a condition to be accounted for. Anastasia never spoke publicly about the visit. Men like him rarely explained outcomes that did not favor them, but his behavior afterward reflected the lesson. There were no follow-up attempts to assert control, no indirect pressure applied through surrogates. The absence of continued effort told its own story. When Anastasia moved on, others understood why. The story circulated quietly among captains and advisors, not as a cautionary tale framed in emotion, but as an operational note. Harlem resisted direct enforcement. Harlem maintained internal order. Harlem carried political and social visibility that made overt action costly. These details mattered to men who thought in terms of risk. Bumpy's approach left no clear target. There was no single action to retaliate against, no insult to avenge. Anastasia had not been embarrassed publicly. He had not been threatened. He had simply been denied. That denial was harder to counter than aggression. Years later, when Anastasia was murdered in a midtown barbershop, the men who planned and approved it were thinking about different problems. But the memory of Harlem remained. It was part of the accumulated understanding that even the most feared figures operated within constraints. Power, when confronted by systems rather than individuals, lost its usual leverage. Bumpy Johnson continued to rule Harlem until his death, not by expanding aggressively, but by maintaining balance. He did not challenge the Mafia beyond what was necessary. He did not provoke unnecessary tests. That restraint ensured the lesson of Anastasia's visit remained intact. There was no need to repeat it. The Mafia never forgot because forgetting would have invited repetition. Each time questions of territory or influence arose involving Harlem, the memory surfaced. It did not require retelling. It existed as assumption. Harlem was approached differently because it had proven itself different. This memory also influenced how the Mafia viewed other autonomous operators. It reinforced the idea that local legitimacy could outweigh external force if it was deeply rooted. Not every territory could be taken. Some had to be managed through accommodation. Bumpy's legacy in this regard was subtle. He did not change the structure of organized crime in New York. He exposed a limit within it. That exposure mattered. It shaped behavior without confrontation. The walk into Harlem remained a moment without spectacle, but heavy with consequence. It demonstrated that survival did not always require dominance. Sometimes it required endurance and clarity. Anastasia had sought to impose certainty. He left with it instead. The Mafia remembered because the lesson was useful. It reminded them that even men built on violence had to recognize environments where violence failed to to produce results. Harlem was one of those environments, and Bumpy Johnson was the reason.